General Moore's divisional plan for the advance on Port Stanley involved 3 Commander Brigade continuing to advance as planned, with 5 Brigade taking the southern flank. Captain Will Townend, who was the SO3 G3 in 5 Brigade headquarters, will now tell you of the 5 Brigade plan.
Commander 5 Brigade's plan to get his brigade forward to Fitzroy involved leapfrogging the 2 Guards battalions forward under the cover of their supporting artillery. At the same time, 17 Gurkha Rifles were to go to Goose Green to relieve 2 Para, who were now under command 5 Brigade and were to go into reserve. The brigade began to disembark in San Carlos water on the 1st of June. The Gurkhas went as planned straight to Goose Green, and the 2 Guards battalions began to dig in on the heights overlooking San Carlos settlement. Although the battalions were ready to move on landing, it was to be several days before sufficient logistic support had been landed and married up with the units for them to carry out sustained operations. The main problem facing the brigade at this stage was the shortage of movement resources. Meanwhile, the commander's plan had to change. On the 2nd of June, he visited 2 Para at Goose Green, where he learned that it was likely that the telephone line between Swan Inlet House, which is about halfway to Fitzroy, and Fitzroy and Bluff Cove might still be working, and those settlements clear of the enemy. A patrol was duly dispatched by helicopter, made the telephone call, and the settlement managers confirmed that the Argentinians had gone. The patrol was led by the OC of B Company 2 Para, and when they got to Swan Inlet House, all they had to do was to crank the handle on the telephone the right number of times, and was not, as some of the press reports suggested, left standing outside a phone box fumbling for small change. A hastily assembled force was dispatched to Fitzroy by Chinook, and by last light on the 2nd of June, 2 Para were secure in Bluff Cove and Fitzroy, and 5 Brigade were 35 miles closer to Stanley. But 2 Para were now out on a limb, and urgently required reinforcement, firstly with artillery, and then additional infantry. The weather, however, deteriorated, and only the artillery and vital stores, such as 2 Para's Bergens, could be moved forward by helicopter. 1 Welsh Guards attempted to cross the Sussex Mountains and move forward to Fitzroy on foot on the 3rd of June, with their mortars, Browning machine guns and ammunition loaded onto 2 civilian tractors. The attempt, however, had to be abandoned after 3 kilometres, as the tractors had bogged in up to their axles. The battalion could have continued on light scales, but the likelihood of them ever seeing their equipment again was considered remote. A plan was therefore made to move the 2 Guards battalions round by sea from San Carlos. 2 Scots Guards sailed round to Bluff Cove aboard HMS Intrepid on the night of the 5th and 6th of June, and were followed the next night by 1 Welsh Guards aboard HMS Fearless. The LSL Sir Tristram also moved round that night, with elements of the logistic units and 2 days' combat supplies, and was to be followed the night after by further LSL, the Sir Galahad, with more stores and equipment. Finally, 17 Gurkha Rifles, who had been carrying out patrols in Lafonia, flew by helicopter to Bluff Cove on the 9th and 10th of June, leaving C Company to guard Goose Green.
Lieutenant Willie Sims from my battalion will now tell you of the Galahad and the Tristram incident.
The problem of sailing from San Carlos to Fitzroy was the distance. The trip had to be made by night because of threat of air attack. Thus the plan for the Guards battalions was that each one would go round by a salt ship to the vicinity of Lively Island and complete the journey by landing craft, arriving before dawn, whilst the assault ship returned to San Carlos under cover of darkness. This the Scots Guards did. However, the picture was further complicated by the shortage of landing craft, which were much in demand at Teal, Fitzroy and San Carlos. Therefore, when Fearless sailed with the Welsh Guards on the night 6th-7th June, it was planned that she should have 2 of her own landing craft and RV with 2 of Intrepids from Fitzroy at Lively Island. The weather prevented these setting out, so it meant that 2 rifle companies and the mortar platoon remained on board and returned to San Carlos under cover of darkness. The next night, both assault ships had other tasks, so it was decided to transfer the troops from Fearless to the RFA Sir Galahad, which was due to sail for Fitzroy that night. From Fitzroy, it was intended that the Welsh Guards should go to Bluff Cove by landing craft. Other units embarking were the main dressing station of 16 Field Ambulance and also a troop of T-Air Defence Battery. Loading took longer than planned and was not complete until 0100 Zulu on the 8th of June. The master of Sir Galahad signalled to say that he would not make the trip that night because he'd be unable to get to Fitzroy and offload the troops before dawn. A signal was returned, saying Galahad must sail that night. There was, after all, mounting pressure to get Fire Brigade into position for the next phase of the attack. Sir Galahad arrived off Fitzroy as dawn was breaking, 1100 Zulu. It was a very clear but bitterly cold day. On arrival, delay in disembarking was caused because the one Mexifloat and one landing craft available had just loaded with stores from the Sir Tristram, which had arrived the night before. This was at least a 2-hour job. The Rapier troop, meanwhile, was offloaded by helicopter, but did not have enough fire units to cover both the anchorage and the ground troops. The anchorage was to be covered by the combat air patrol. The only Rapier that did overlook the harbour became unserviceable. Next, elements of 16 Field Ambulance disembarked. It was not until 1630 Zulu that the first landing craft became available to offload the Welsh Guards. At 1705, 4 Skyhawks screamed over the harbour. Sir Tristram and Sir Galahad were both hit by bombs. The combat air patrol was already busy in action over HMS Plymouth. The effect of the attack was shattering. Many soldiers burned to death, trapped in the stern. The blast and fireball ripped through the ship. Welsh Guardsmen made their way into the bow and fell in by platoons whilst the roll was taken. One Guardsman, a former steel worker from Port Talbot, grabbed special firefighting kit he'd been trained to use as a civilian. He saved as many lives as he could. Helicopter pilots risked their lives, whilst medics and men of 2 Para did invaluable service in helping our injured ashore. It was a day of tragedy and great bravery. In all, the cost of the battalion was great. 39 men dead and 78 injured. All individual kit was lost. In effect, we were now short of 2 rifle companies and a mortar platoon. In terms of morale, we were naturally heartbroken to lose so many fine men and good friends. However, we became more determined to get on with the job in hand.
On the 10th of June, the brigades were poised along the line Mount Estancia, Mount Kent, Mount Challenger to Bluff Cove and Port Fitzroy, ready for the final push towards Stanley. Not shown here, 40 Commando remained behind at San Carlos to protect the forward maintenance area, and 1 company of the 1st 7th Gurkhas had been left behind to hold Goose Green and Darwin. My own battalion had now been reinforced by Alpha and Charlie companies of 40 Commando. The General's operation order for the final attack was issued on the 9th of June. At this stage, the Argentines had 2 infantry regiments and a Marine Infantry Battalion plus, holding all the main features between the Phoebe and Port Stanley, with the exception of Mount Wall. The plan was to capture Port Stanley by a 3-phase attack. In Phase 1, 3 Commando Brigade was ordered to secure 3 objectives on the night the 11th-12th June, and the brigade commander therefore tasked 3 Para to capture Mount Longdon, 4-5 Commando to capture the 2 Sisters, 2 Para to be in reserve and be prepared to support either 3 Para or 4-5 Commando, and 4-2 Commando to capture Goat Ridge and Mount Harriet, with the Welsh Guards securing their start line. In Phase 2 of the force plan, scheduled for the night 12th-13th of June, 3 Commando Brigade was given the task, which it allocated to 2 Para, now back under its command, of securing Wireless Ridge, with the SAS and the SBS carrying out a diversionary attack on Courtly Hill. 2 remaining Phase 2 objectives were given to 5 Brigade, whose commander ordered the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards to capture Mount Tumbledown and the 1st 7th Gurkhas to secure Mount William. The Welsh Guards were to be in reserve. All the Phase 2 attacks were delayed until the night of the 13th-14th of June to ensure that the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards start line, just to the east of Mount Harriet, was properly secured, and also to allow more time for movement and reconnaissance. The objectives were then taken on the night 13th-14th of June. Phase 3 of the plan, the capture of Sapper Hill, was finally given to my battalion. At this stage, the Argentines were in complete disarray, and maintaining the momentum of our advance was all important. Just as we crossed our start line, the orders to cease fire except in self-defence were given. My leading platoon suffered 2 minor casualties from small arms fire as they had been landed in error too far forward by helicopter. That was the only resistance we encountered. The Argentine will to resist had been broken, and they streamed back to Stanley, leaving their dead behind them. Captain Ian Gardner, who commanded X-ray Company of 4-5 Commando, will now tell you of his experiences during the Battle of the Two Sisters.
The Two Sisters is a rocky dragon's back of a feature which ascends from 300 feet to about 1,000 feet with 2 parallel ridges about 1,000 metres apart connected by a saddle. It was believed to be defended by a strong rifle company supported with their own mortars. The commando plan of attack was a simple one. It was to be a 2-phase attack, with my company, X Company, taking the southern sister from the west at 0100 hours, and the other 2 companies, Yankee and Zulu, taking the other 2 features which comprise the northern sister at 0300 hours. The artillery fire plan was to be a silent one, and we were ordered to be prepared to sweep on to Mount Tumbledown on completion. A number of reconnaissance and harassing patrols had already inserted themselves into the enemy positions and had killed 19 enemy before the attack started. And they had also established that there were no minefields on our intended approaches. My company had grouped with it the anti-tank troop of 40 Commando Royal Marines equipped with Milan, and although this weapon was to prove a most useful anti-bunker, anti-Sanger weapon, we discovered to our cost that it was not readily man-packable across that sort of country, and we were very seriously delayed in our march to the forming up point. And in the event, both phases of the commando attack had to start together at 0400 hours. And the contribution that this made to the fog of war was considerable, because not only had we thereby lost 1 hour of precious darkness, but we'd lost for that time the use of a naval gunfire frigate, because they had to leave the area by daylight. And the consecutive nature of the commando attack had now meant that the artillery and the mortars, which had been planned to support each phase, now had to support twice the number of work going on at the same time, and someone therefore was going to lose out. Fortune smiled on the main body, Yankee and Zulu, as they went to ground to await my by now late company. An artillery DF landed smack in front of them, and had they still been mobile, they certainly would have been caught. But after overcoming these initial hiccups, the commando attack went surprisingly close to plan. Yankee and Zulu got within 300 metres of the enemy positions before they were detected, and they were engaged with mortars and heavy machine guns, 5.0 machine guns, from at least 3 different positions. Although it's curious to note that a certain amount of this machine gun fire actually went high, and we presume this was because it was being fired by inexperienced troops downhill at night. 4-5 Commando's anti-tank troop had lost all their Milan during the bombing at Ajax Bay, and the commanding officer had reformed them as a weapons troop, and had grouped a section from this troop with each of Yankee and Zulu companies, and they were equipped with 3 extra machine guns and 5 Carl Gustavs, and they were deployed well forward with the assaulting troops. And the weight of fire put down by this formidable body as soon as the battle was opened enabled our own assaulting troops to very quickly cross the open ground between them and the enemy rocks, and they pressed on very quickly up into the rocks. Once there, it was almost like fighting in a built-up area where one man moves and another man covers. We made maximum use of artillery, although because Yankee and Zulu had got so close to the enemy positions undetected, they were only able to use artillery on the easternmost feature for safety reasons. Mortars were less useful because after firing a few rounds, the base plates disappeared into the bog. After 3 or 4 hours fighting through rock by rock, both companies were secure on their objective. As for my own company, it was with considerable apprehension that I dispatched my leading rifle troop across 1,000 metres of open, moonlit ground to the rocks at the base of the enemy position. However, as well as covering them with Milan, I too had formed my own weapons section, and they were equipped with 7 extra machine guns. I must point out the implications of being scaled as an Arctic unit. As well as having the GPMGs, we have the magazine-fed LMGs for use in the snow. And we cheated. We took both temperate and Arctic weapons with us. And this meant that I had 19 machine guns in my company. And it made a difference. This weapons section went with the leading troop on a parallel axis, about 200 metres to its left, its northern flank, and it covered the leading troop and in turn the other 2 troops as they moved up the rocks. I couldn't believe my ears when the leading troop commander told me he'd secured his objective, the first pile of rocks, unopposed. I very quickly moved my second troop on through him and followed on behind with my company headquarters. And we were about halfway up the Dragon's Back, the enemy ridge, before they detected us and engaged us. We came under fire from several machine guns and an anti-tank weapon. And at this stage, we too had got too close to use the artillery effectively. And so I decided that it was more important to prepare the enemy position properly with artillery than to keep the momentum we had already now accrued. And so I broke off contact. I withdrew my leading troops and started calling for artillery and mortars. And mortars were only able to fire 4 rounds before they ceased firing as a result of the problem I've already described. And the artillery, God bless them, were not available at all. All the batteries were on other, more pressing tasks. Although I must confess, I did feel that my own task was pretty pressing at the time. So, the leading troop went in, supported only by Milan at extreme range. Again, it was like fighting in a built-up area. I found myself becoming pretty superfluous once I'd given my orders. Communications broke down between me and my leading troop commander, and between him and his sections. And he too, once he had committed his sections to the battle, found himself becoming pretty superfluous. And the battle was fought by corporals and marines working in pairs, largely beyond the influence of their immediate superiors. Eventually, our superior firepower wore them out, and some 3 or 4 hours later, we too secured our objective. And from towards the end of this battle, for the next 24 hours or more, we were subjected to intermittent enemy artillery fire. And it was from this that we took our only casualty. We found 7 enemy dead on the position and bits of a few more. Within the whole commando, we lost 4 men killed and 13 wounded. There were over 40 enemy there whom we captured. The rest had fled either to Mount Tumbledown or straight on to Stanley. And I remain completely convinced that if they had held that position the way we would have held it, it would have been quite impregnable. And that night, at my O group, we were sitting as a little huddled group of officers on the rocks on our newly acquired position, slightly nervous, slightly edgy, being shelled, and a figure appeared out of the gloom. And I wondered with some irritation how the hell it had got past our sentries without being challenged. and we were very relieved to hear the voice of our padre, our Welsh padre, who'd marched with us right across the island and been with my company throughout the battle, shouting, "Hello, X-ray company! Hello, X-ray company! It's only the vicar, and I've forgotten the fucking password!"
Lieutenant James Stewart commanded 13 platoon from the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards, and he now takes up the story 2 nights later on Tumbledown Mountain.
My company was the second one to advance onto Tumbledown, and the platoon's task was to advance up the gully on the left of the feature. The high spine of rocks in the centre of the mountain virtually isolated the platoon from the remainder of the company. We advanced up the gully 2 sections forward, one in the high rocks and one in the gully itself. The third section moved up to the rear. The noise and flashes of artillery fire and mortar fire amongst us immediately created a communication problem between the sections, who were already having difficulty in negotiating the rocky ground. Almost immediately we came under highly accurate machine gun fire, and sniper fire from sangers and men concealed amongst the many crevasses. 7 guardsmen were hit. My platoon sergeant and his bodyguard were killed whilst moving the 84mm team into a firing position. 1 guardsman was hit, but saved by his magazines placed in his breast pocket, and after completing a somersault and shooting past my left ear, he calmly stood up, dusted himself off, fired his rifle, and collapsed in a quivering heap behind a rock. Casualty evacuation became a problem, as sniper fire prevented stretcher bearers reaching us. We moved the walking wounded down the mountain and rendered what aid we could to those we couldn't move. The platoon was confused and totally disorientated. We couldn't see who was firing at us, and we'd lost all the momentum. The guardsmen didn't want to fire for fear of hitting each other, and this delay could have been critical, as it allowed time for us to think far too much about the numerous possibilities our situation opened us up to. I ordered the right-hand section to move round and eliminate any snipers they could. And with a great cry of "Follow me," the section's second-in-command set off, and blithely stepped off the edge of the cliff. The sangers were dealt with by 66mm anti-tank rockets, grenades, a hail of fire, and the bayonet, the one following after the other. One of my section commanders got carried away and removed an Argentine sniper from a crevasse with a 66mm rocket from a range of 6 meters. The initiative once again gained. Platoon advanced, clearing the rocks by firing into every likely place and following up again with the bayonet. This type of fighting placed a great deal of responsibility and pressure on the individual guardsmen, who were already tired and scared. But their attitude was that the battalion was on that bloody mountain and they intended to stay there. Finally, unbelievably, the noise stopped and the gully was clear. It had taken us 9 hours to fight for 200 meters of ground. We hurriedly rejoined the remainder of the company on the top of the mountain. Tired, with our ears ringing, we watched as the dawn broke and we could see Argentinian troops streaming back into Stanley. I felt no particular elation, just very tired. We had 50 rounds left between us and the platoon. The platoon also had 4 guardsmen killed and 3 wounded, but we carried 28 Argentinian bodies back off the mountain.
During the nights 11th, 12th and 13th of June, the other objectives mentioned were successfully captured, all the battles being fought with equal ferocity. 4-2 Commando successfully captured Mount Harriet and Goat Ridge. 3 Para, Mount Longdon. 2 Para, with the SAS and the SBS, Wireless Ridge. And the 1st 7th Gurkhas occupied Mount William. The Welsh Guards were now in possession of Sapper Hill. None of us will forget the morning of the 14th of June, as we watched the Argentines, their will completely broken, streaming back towards Stanley. 2 and 3 Para were ordered to follow up. The battalions moved forward, and shortly afterwards the British flag was run up once again over Stanley. Now that in fairly broad terms is how the campaign was fought. Now for some facts and figures. First of all, ship losses. Aircraft losses. Casualties. So much for the facts and figures. What you've not heard about is the part that the arms and the services play. And we'll start by intelligence, given to you by Major David Burrell, who was on the staff of General Moore.
When the Argentine invaded the Falkland Islands, we possessed little basic intelligence on their armed forces or their capabilities. Time available to rectify this and to acquire sufficient current intelligence with which to support operations was very limited. Set against this backcloth, the achievements were considerable. Sufficient background intelligence was acquired to enable our forces to familiarise themselves with the basics during the passage south. And as far as current intelligence is concerned, the strengths and the final locations of Argentine forces on the islands had been accurately gauged by the 20th of May, though we'd had 90% of the picture since late April. Contrary to some press reports, our strength assessments were accurate throughout, with the exception of Goose Green Darwin, where we did get it wrong. We got it wrong because there'd been a last-minute reinforcement, but we had predicted the likelihood of such a reinforcement. Whilst our knowledge of the broad situation on the islands was extremely good, it was less so in the case of the greater detail desired by battalion and company commanders. Once acquired, the timely dissemination of intelligence sometimes proved difficult, particularly below brigade level, due to communications problems. We had only 3 sources with the potential of providing the detail of individual defensive positions. These were tactical questioners, air photo recce, and patrols. Tactical questioners, of whom there were very few, did produce valuable information. But as some of the stories from the Argentinians were contradictory, assessing their reliability proved a problem. Nevertheless, given the preparedness of the Argentinians to talk, I do wish in retrospect that we'd taken more tactical questioners with us. Incidentally, of significance to the future, it was quite clear from tactical questioning that to a man the Argentines believed in their cause. One captured officer related to his questioner how much he'd enjoyed his visits to the United Kingdom. The questioner replied that he couldn't comment on Argentina, as he'd never been there. "But you have. You're there now," came the indignant reply. Air photography was extremely disappointing. Suffice it to say here that what we needed down there was a drone system. I think that the activities of Special Force and unit patrols were one of the intelligence success stories, producing as they did much detailed information, including extremely important negative information. Many uncertainties remained. Had the intelligence function been carried out professionally and uniformly at all levels, there would have been fewer question marks. But question marks there would have been. And quite frankly, one of the major lessons that we should all hoist in is that intelligence is not a definitive science. Unrealistic training and often inadequate education predisposes too many of our customers to expect and sometimes rely on the unachievable. As I've said, there were uncertainties, but the commander was satisfied that he had sufficient intelligence to go ahead. Events proved him right.
The part played by Special Forces is told to you by Captain Chris Brown.
Special Forces, the Special Air Service, the Special Boat Squadron, supported by 2 naval gunfire forward observation teams, carried out the following tasks. The intelligence gathering task began on the night of 1st and 2nd of May with the insertion of 13 4-man patrols into East and West Falkland by Sea Kings flown by pilots equipped with passive night goggles. These patrols built up a composite picture to enable the amphibious plans to be formulated. They also identified targets for naval gunfire, fighter-ground attack, and direct action raids. The land war began in earnest with the SAS raid on Pebble Island. A patrol was inserted onto West Island to recce the settlement and look for the suspected enemy radar. Having landed on West Falkland, they carried their klepper canoes cross-country and hid them in a valley. They then observed Pebble Island to confirm that there were no enemy at the proposed canoe landing points. After dark, the patrol canoed across, avoiding a known tidal rip, and 2 men moved to a suitable observation post after caching their canoes. After last light the following day, they radioed to HMS Hermes, 11 aircraft, believe real, attack tonight. Under cover of darkness, the remainder of the squadron flew into Pebble Island and moved quickly across the country towards the airfield. We were heavily laden and thankfully dropped our mortar bombs at the baseplate position. 1 troop covered the settlement, while the others, having achieved complete surprise, began destroying the aircraft. We withdrew at 0745 Zulu, having destroyed 11 aircraft, fuel and ammunition, with only token enemy resistance. SBS patrols reconnoitred landing beaches and hinterlands all round the East Island, paying particular attention in the end to the San Carlos area. Their timely information influenced the commander of 3 Commander Brigade to land at San Carlos Water. Using thermal imagery, the SBS were able to pinpoint and eliminate the enemy threat on Fanning Head. After the landings, Special Forces moved well forward of 3 Commander Brigade to Mount Kent and down Teal Inlet, pathfinding for 4-5 Commando and 3 Para. Reconnaissance patrols were inserted onto most of the small western islands in search of aircraft, and the major settlements at Fox Bay and Port Howard were harassed by raiding patrols using naval gunfire support. During the final assault around Stanley, Special Forces provided a dramatic and, in the event, lively diversion to allow 2 Para to successfully achieve their objective. Special Forces, with their unique communications equipment and training, were closely involved in the final surrender negotiations, and by their ubiquitous presence played a major role in the campaign.
Major Martin Osborne will now cover some points applicable to the infantry.
For the infantry, very few general tactical lessons emerged from the Falkland Islands. But old lessons, outside our individual experiences, were relearned, and we each gained a tremendous amount of experience in how best to put those lessons into action. We relearned the importance of heavy concentrations of automatic fire from GPMGs and LMGs, and these, in the attack, backed up by a hard punch from our own battalion direct fire support weapons. 2 Para, before leaving the UK, had armed themselves with 2 GPMGs per rifle section. 4-2 and 4-5 Commando were similarly armed, and it was this rate of fire, in sections depleted by weather casualties, which became the basis of all our fire and movement. In daylight, at the long ranges at which engagements were opened, the SLR actually played very little part in the firefight. At night, in close-quarter fighting, the SLR was found to be unwieldy and lacking an automatic fire capability. Some units, as you heard from the Scots Guards, found the 66mm extremely useful. It was infinitely preferable to the 84, which, with its crippling double marching load of weapon and ammunition, was more appropriately used at company level, where it saw useful service. Milan was deployed well forward in companies, and was mainly used as a bunker buster. The size of the warhead and the standoff firing distance possible in the open terrain of the Falklands gave the enemy some very nasty surprises. Any resume of infantry weapons in the Falklands will be incomplete without mention of our indirect fire resources. 81mm mortars had serious baseplate problems on the soft and on the very hard ground, and the number of mortarmen received severe knee injuries from this. But where the ground would support the baseplate, fire was brought down to extremely good effect. The Royal Artillery, a popular target for infantry abuse in peacetime, they earned our unstinting gratitude and appreciation when their rounds fell down to our front. To doff our hats to the Navy, the rhythmic thumping of the frigate automated gun systems became a popular and familiar nighttime sound to our soldiers, and they caused havoc to the enemy, both physically and, as you'll hear shortly, mentally. It was a common observation among many commanders that many of our younger soldiers, with no experience beyond the 4-day exercise, were mentally unprepared for the protracted rough living, and a proportion of our casualties between the 5 to 14 day points were almost certainly due to this factor alone. Our principal observation from this is that the field phases of our peacetime exercises are simply not long enough. Everyone was staggered, quite literally and physically staggered, by the weight of our first-line ammunition scales. This again can only be a failing of our peacetime training, where we seem reluctant to break down ammunition, issue it, march with it, and fire it. When it became apparent to us that we could only fire what we marched with, and that resupply was going to be uncertain, all our loads were stripped to the bare essentials: food, but above everything else, ammunition. Whether it was the unaccustomed heavy loads or an inadequacy of our compo-only diet, I don't know. But despite hard physical training on board ship, there was still a significant number of exhaustion and exposure casualties. Later on, when marching forward meant missing a day's rations here and there, oddly, it was the lean and athletic who fell out first, despite their obvious physical fitness. Leaders at all levels, motivated mentally, had a distinct advantage. But the stockier individual who carries a bit of spare, even when fit, actually came out best. Now, rather than let you go away thinking that's a personal plug on behalf of people built like me, may I say that one of the first people I had to put into a sleeping bag on top of a mountain was the PT buster who'd beasted me around the decks of the Canberra for 6 weeks. What we're actually driving at here is to prepare soldiers to carry these sort of loads across that sort of terrain. You've got to go for battle PT. And what you're actually aiming to do is to build up the endurance and stamina of your soldiers.
The field artillery points will be covered by Captain Rod Jenkins, who was an FOO with 29 Commander Regiment.
I've drawn together a number of points concerning artillery in an all-arms context. Now, there's nothing particularly new in what follows, but more so points which need relearning. The rapport so necessary between the artillery and the infantry was quickly established during the passage south, and some useful training together took place. This was an excellent start for what lay ahead. Sometimes the infantry appeared a trifle disappointed at the effects our shells were having. It's a point to remember that artillery rounds are only likely to do much killing in the first 20 seconds of an engagement. Thereafter, the enemy will have taken cover, and the effect is one of neutralization. Now, this isn't as feeble as it may sound, since 3/4 of the problem is cracked if you can persuade the enemy to stop firing at you. Also, artillery is not a precision weapon, and by that I mean if we actually hit a bunker, a machine gun post, or a slit trench, it's a bonus. For that sort of game, you need a direct fire weapon. The numerous tons of artillery ammunition that needed moving dictated the pace of the battle, and bearing in mind the limited helicopters available, the system worked extremely well. We never did run out of ammunition, albeit we came close to it on a few occasions. When the regiment was deployed in the Mount Kent estancia area prior to the main push towards Stanley, battery commanders and forward observers were limited to 100 rounds per battery per day. Myself and my party sat up on Mount Wall, just 2 kilometres away from the enemy positions on Mount Harriet, and found it extremely annoying not to be able to blast them all day long. This tight control was vital, otherwise our expenditure would have exceeded our resupply rate, and we would then never have built up enough stocks to support the major final attacks. For the Darwin Goose Green battle, only 3 guns supported 2 para. This was totally inadequate, but time and helicopter availability precluded any more. In retrospect, we needed a whole regiment there. A number of silent attacks were accomplished during this campaign, and there were good reasons for silent attacks. However, the advantages need to be weighed up against the merits of a noisy attack and giving the enemy a thorough pounding by artillery before you get to him. One of the major disadvantages of going in silently, and one so soon rediscovered during this campaign, is that when your attack ultimately does turn noisy, the enemy is often too close to use artillery effectively. It's interesting to note that the only battalion to do 2 attacks, and that is 2 para, went noisy from the start of their second one. Finally, a word about the gun itself. You've heard how the mortars disappeared into the bog. Well, we gunners had similar problems. As a general rule, a gun would have to be repositioned after firing between 30 and 50 rounds. By that time, the trails would be in up to the layer's seat, resulting in the reference object being lost, the the breech hitting the ground on recoil, and the layer getting a wet arse. It was no mean feat keeping our guns firing. There were vast quantities of ammunition that had to be manhandled by the gun crews, and it's questionable whether they could have kept up the high rate of fire for very much longer during the final stage, with the present establishment of men to guns. For all of that, we had a good war, and it was nice to be appreciated by the infantry.
Captain Chris Brown will now cover naval gunfire support.
During the campaign, the 5 forward observation teams of 148 Commando Forward Observation Battery supported all the operations by major units and most of the Special Forces operations. From South Georgia to Stanley, 63 bombardments malleted the enemy with more than 8,000 rounds, 179 tons of HE. Unlike field artillery, naval gunships are not always dedicated to providing fire support and may have other simultaneous tasks which may delay the fire support, not the least of which was self-protection, which was paramount in the hostile air environment. This led to most of the NGS being carried out at night, when ships were safe against air attack, but not against Exocet, as unfortunately Glamorgan found out. Naval illumination shells were not reliable, and the coordination of illumination and HE takes time. It was quicker, therefore, to adjust through night observation devices, which were not initially issued to us, and had to be scrounged or liberated. The 4.5-inch HE shell was very impressive, especially when fused for proximity airburst, which amongst the rocks and on the boggy ground was far more devastating than the groundburst, which tended to dig in. Like field artillery, NGS is a weapon of neutralization and demoralization, a job which it did superbly well throughout the campaign. Night after night, NGS kept the enemy awake, made him stand to in the freezing cold, destroyed his kit and defences, and killed or injured his comrades too slow or too foolish to take cover. Probably the best testimony to its effect came from the diary of a captured Argentine sergeant. The early pages indicate his honour and euphoria at being sent to the Malvinas, but as the days passed, his morale sank as he recorded, in ever-deteriorating handwriting, the demoralizing and debilitating effect of the bombardment. In his final entry, having seen his mucker killed by naval gunfire, he longed only for a return to the mainland.
In Part 4, we will continue the story of the parts played by the arms and the services.